All right, hello everybody. We are going to move on to chapter 9 this week. So hopefully you have start with your quiz. I always recommend starting with the quiz. That way you get your eyes on, the content. We're going to be doing race and ethnicity. And so this just, when we talk about race and ethnicity on a 100 level, it can be a lot. Race and ethnicity is a very confusing chapter. So there's no expectation that your first introduction to race and ethnicity, you're gonna get everything and understand everything. So I always like to start out with that because there's kind of this expectation that, oh my gosh, okay, I need to understand the difference. I need to understand everything there is to know about race. Race and ethnicity goes all the way up to 600 level courses and above. And this is a 100 level. So I try and bite it down to bite-sized chunks, and I don't want to overwhelm you. It's going to seem like I'm throwing a lot of information and content and etc. But just remember that this is an introduction version of race and ethnicity. So let's just jump right in to chapter 9. If I can make this bigger. Alrighty, chapter 9. So this idea of understanding if race biological, right? Is race biological? And the answer is no, right? And the answer is no. Race is a socially constructed idea. We are taught to place people in racial categories based off of their physical features. Skin tone, hair texture, eye shape, etc. We associate with a racial category. So racial categories are things like white, black, Hispanic, arguably. That one gets very complicated. Asian is also a racial category. You see, they're very broad. They're very, very broad, very general categories. And they say a lot in our society about power and privilege, right? So this idea of, I always go back to the black and white, we call it a dichotomy, black and white dichotomy. White is, we are taught from a very young age, our society was set up from a very early point through enslavement, right, of African people, that white is superior, black is inferior. So they were set up on these two very opposite ends of the spectrum, right? And the term black even is socially constructed, right? The term is socially constructed. It was created, it was man-made. And what we do is we associate certain physical features to blackness, right? And so this is a picture of my daughter. She's black, y'all. And that always really surprises people. She was so little here. I should show an updated one. She was 2, she's 4 now. But her hair is blonder, her eyes, you can't see here, but she has blue eyes. My husband and I are both, I would say, pretty much my skin tone. And yet we have this very light-skinned, blue-eyed, blonde-haired daughter. And it really throws people off because we have been taught that being black looks a certain way, which is not true, right? It's not true. You can find people from all over the world, right, who would place themselves in like this quote, and I'm putting in quotation marks, black category, who have lighter skin, different curl textures, different eye colors. And it's really because we've been socialized to believe that blackness looks in a certain way. It's hard for us to believe that blackness can also have different physical features, right? And so just think about this, right? What physical features are valued in our society, and how do you know, right? We are taught to value whiteness. You see it, beauty standards are based off of white women in particular, even white men, I would say on some aspects, where we have this value. I remember when I was in high school, I permed my hair straight. It was bone straight. I had not a curl in sight. And it was because I got made fun of a lot for the texture of my hair. It was like, well, how can you be on the dance team if you can't even wear your hair in a ponytail? This is my hair in a ponytail, by the way. It's like a puff. So you can imagine, like, when you're on any type of performance team where there's an expectation of a uniform look, I never fit, right? I was always the one that stood out. It's like, oh, Shantae, that's your hair in a ponytail? It's like, yeah, it's my hair in a ponytail. And so I permed my hair straight because there was this idea that my hair was somehow less than, or, you know, people would put things in my hair in class or tell me they couldn't see if I sat in front of them. And so this idea that having thick, and I think this is becoming more socially accepted now. So you may or may not relate to this if you have hair texture similar to mine. But when I was in high school, having natural, puffy, curly hair was not the thing. And it was really not that long ago. It was a little over 10 years ago. But that's how quickly things change, right? Trends and this idea that all of a sudden people are accepting Black women in their natural hair, which I have so many things to say about that. But when I was in high school, it was not the thing, right? People valued straight hair, the light eyes. I remember a lot of my friends who were darker skinned, even than me, would put in the blue contacts, the green contacts, right? Because there's this value of whiteness in relationship to who is beautiful and what type of beauty standards we value in our society. And you can mostly see that by looking at commercials, right? All the commercials about the skin, the hair, etc. They're trying to change this, right? They're trying to include more darker skinned Black women, more Latina women, etc. But ultimately, these companies were founded on beauty standards surrounded and created through whiteness. So race is very different than this idea of ethnicity. So remember, race is socially constructed. These categories, Black, white, Asian, they're socially constructed. It's like, oh, we think all Asian people are smart, right? That is a social construction around this idea of race, right? There are cultural things that tell us why Asian Americans, or in particular, Koreans, Japanese, Chinese, those are ethnicities, by the way. Actually, not even really, right? They even get more complex than that. Even saying Chinese is a broad category, right? We kind of put them under the category of ethnicity, but even within China, there are multiple ethnic identities within that, right? Different cultural beliefs, different celebrations, different way of dress. And so just because somebody has originated from the country of China does not mean that they identify as Chinese, right? They may be Han, right? There's all of these different complexities and cultural dynamics that happen even within the country of China, right? Or even, a lot of people put Africans all in one category, right? Oh, they're from Africa. Africa is a huge continent. Are they from Somalia? Are they from Kenya? Are they from somewhere in East Africa, right? Ghana. There's all of these different ethnic origins and cultural practices from the country of Africa. And that's what we mean by ethnicity, right? Ethnicity is a variety of categories that fall under this construction of race, but they have cultural significance. And we'll continue to talk about the difference between race and ethnicity. So race is a broad category of people, Black, white, Asian, right? And it comes with this, they all come with expectations, assumptions, stereotypes, etc. And it's assumed to be based in biology, right? So when people see my white appearing daughter, I've literally had people tell me, oh, she looks like she could be adopted. As if it's not possible for two Black people to create a lighter skinned child. Like, it is 100% possible, and with blue eyes, right? There are things called recessive traits. Like, there are things, that genetics are very complicated, but because we've been so socialized to believe that race looks like a certain thing or acts like a certain thing, we have a hard time believing when someone doesn't fit that mold. And so that's what I mean by saying race is a forced grouping. So someone may be from France, right? And they have dark skin, curly, kinky hair, and this, I'm like picturing someone that I know, right, from France. And we look at them, we're like, oh, that's a Black person, right? Because we see the darker skin, we see the hair texture, and we put them into that category of Black. But when you ask them, right, what they are, if you ask, I think it's important to ask people how they identify before we place them into these categories. They don't identify as Black, right? They identify as French, It gets very confusing, right? And that is why this idea of race is a forced grouping. We people look at other people and we put them into these categories, right? Oh, that's a Black person, it's a white person. Oh, they must be mixed. Oh, they must be blah, 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 based off of their physical features. Ethnicity is where you get into the more specific categories. Jamaican, Polish, Chinese, even like I said, Chinese, even you can break that down into different cultural groups, different ethnic origins, because it's very much based on these cultural practices. So if you take someone who's quote Black like me, right, in the United States, and you put me in the same category as someone who is from Kenya, right? We may look the same, put that in quotes. We may have the same hair, skin, etc. But culturally, we are very, very, very different, right? Very different. So this idea of ethnicity is self-affirmed. So meaning you could be somebody who is a part of an ethnic group because you've learned the language, you've become accustomed to the different beliefs and customs that they practice. So maybe if I was born in the United States and I end up growing up in Africa, right? Growing up in Ghana, for instance, or Sierra Leone, I could absolutely start to integrate myself into this different ethnic background, cultural background, right? And so it really is up to the person on how they identify when it comes to ethnicity. We're not looking at someone saying, oh, they're Black. It's like, no, I'm actually Haitian, right? Like I actually, because I speak this language and I believe in these specific practices and view things in a very differently in regards to culture, like I am a Haitian person. My husband is actually Haitian, or has his family is Haitian, right? And so this idea of ethnicity is a lot more complex because we're not taught to understand or think about people's backgrounds and their cultural practices before we assume what they are based off of their physical features. And so we're just going to quickly go over, I'm just going to touch on this idea of assimilation. So if you want to look into Robert Merton's race relation cycle, please feel free. It's basically just about power. So when two different groups of people interact with each other, they first compete for scarce resources. Basically, one group wins and the other group that doesn't win those resources is then forced to assimilate. And assimilation is where one ethnic group gradually adopts the culture of another. And this is based on power, right? So we come over, usually, conquer people's land, usually through war, right? Like this is the history of the United States. And we force them to then start to adopting what we believe to be proper cultural or social practices. We do this everywhere, y'all. We've done it in the Middle East. That's kind of the place we tend to do it the most is the Middle East, is we place our own views of what a civilized nation looks like, of what what being right looks like. Like we look at other cultures and say, oh wow, they don't allow X, Y, and Z. That is bad, right? But that's their cultural practice. And so what we do is we go into different countries, or even when people come into our country, sometimes there's this expectation that they then strip their own cultural beliefs, like get rid of them and adopt ours, right? That's assimilation. So there's two different kinds. Cultural assimilation, so where a cultural group learns and accepts the norms and beliefs and practices of an ethnic group where they are living. And so if somebody comes from Japan, right? In Japan, there's a lot of different cultural beliefs, even just the way that they eat, how they eat. For instance, in Japan, it's very accepted to eat loudly, like to slurp and to kind of make noises while you're eating, because it's a sign that you're enjoying your food. It's a sign of respect, right? And that's a cultural practice. My dad found that out when he went to Japan. He stayed for a year. as when he was in the military. And this was different, right? Because in the United States, when someone's slurping, smacking, making noise, it's considered to be rude, right? So let's say somebody comes to the United States and that's their cultural practice, but they start to look around and say, okay, why are people looking at me like that? Or maybe someone even tells them, right? Like, wow, you're smacking. You know, my best friend is someone who like will let people know in a heartbeat that they're smacking because it's not our cultural practice. And so as that person who came from Japan starts to live here in the United States and starts to kind of get used to this idea, okay, well, maybe, you know, Americans don't like loud eating or slurping. So then they stop, right? They stop eating in a way that they would in Japan. They have in some part culturally assimilated. Structural assimilation is where a cultural group becomes physically incorporated into the living and working spaces of another. So this would mean that there are not places like Barrio Logan, right? Or like, we call it like Chinatown, right? All of these places that you see a majority of one ethnic group living, right? We still have highly segregated spaces, right? You have Black communities, you have Chinese communities, you have Latinx communities that live all within Puerto Rican communities that live all within one kind of one cultural space, and they're not fully integrated into the spaces or the neighborhoods outside of that, right? So structural assimilation is not something that I personally believe has fully happened here in the United States. And so something else when we're talking about this idea, it's kind of along the lines of like assimilation and bringing cultures together, is this term called amalgamation or pluralism. So amalgamation is the process through which two groups, usually a minority and a majority group, I said that really weird, combine to form a new group, right? So there's no kind of assimilation process. There's no like, oh, you're going to become a part of me. It's like we are two separate people. We're going to come together and we're going to create a new society. We're going to create a new culture, whether that means, you know, adopting some of your culture and some of mine and forming to mix another one. And almost creating like a new culture, right? And there's no expectation that the minority group gets rid of their culture, right? It's kind of this exchange that happens between the two groups. Or there's this term called pluralism, suggests a mutual respect for one another's cultures among the various groups in society and allows minorities to express their own cultures without experienced prejudice. So amalgamation would be almost in a sense, you're losing a sense of your culture, or like you're expected to strip away parts of yourself in order to fit into this quote new group. It's that idea of I just totally lost the word for it. But pluralism, you could think of like a melting pot, right? We call ourselves, oh, the United States is a melting pot. We allow people to be whoever they want to be, right? And yet we have people who wear hijabs that get discriminated against, that get attacked, that get, you know, all forms of discrimination and prejudice in airports, right? Associated with Muslim culture. We get Black people, right? Black cultures and even Latinx cultures who are heavily policed for having loud music, for having certain types of cars, right? And so, which are very cultural things, right? The large parties, the loud music, the culture of different styles of cars and things like that. Those are heavily policed spaces, right? You have a large party being a part of one of these groups, someone's calling the cops. Like, let's just be honest. Someone's calling the cops depending on where you live, and or that place is going to be heavily policed, right? Heavily policed. And so the question of pluralism is, do we really live in a society that accepts all cultures without prejudice, right? And that's a question I've heard multiple different answers to. But my personal response would be no, like absolutely not. We do not. And so understanding race through a conflict perspective. And so if you are someone doing a project where you're talking about race, right? So you're using conflict theory specifically about race. So like how COVID-19 has impacted Black communities. If you're looking at the school to prison pipeline, almost any of them, y'all, just to be honest. Looking at how racial categories are based on power dynamics. And they make us remember that these groups are created and not naturally occurring. And so a conflict theorist would say that the people with the most power in society, AKA white people, right, create, because of colonization and enslavement of African people, they set themselves up as a superior race, right? And in doing so, they have all the power, right? Powers to create laws, powers to determine who is human, right? The Three-Fifths Compromise, this is written in law. And in doing so, they put all other racial categories as subordinate, right? Subordinate or inferior, if we're gonna kind of use the opposite wording. And so when you're thinking about race as a metaphor for power, there is prejudice, right? Negative attitudes about a group of people. And we all have prejudices, y'all, because we live in a society. We are not immune to social media. We are not immune to movies that teach us specific ideologies about people. And prejudices, again, it's just an attitude, right? It's an attitude, it's a belief about a certain group of people. Ideologies is a belief system that is culturally, socially, and structurally enforced to justify the oppression of certain groups of people. And that comes from these prejudices. These almost kind of happen in steps, right? You have a prejudice about a certain group of people, and you know, that then turns into an ideology, which becomes built within the various systems and structures, and therefore used to justify oppression. So when African people were enslaved, and I keep using this example very intentionally because this really set up the dynamics for race relations in the United States, right? It was the enslavement of African people. When African people were enslaved, they were treated inhumanely. They were not treated like humans, right? And that was done very intentional. And so the ideology, the belief system behind that was that they were, oh, well, we can enslave these people because, you know, they're not viewed as people, right? They're equivalent to animals, right? Animals have more rights than them back then. And so that idea was used to justify the enslavement of African people. And then when ideologies are practiced by those in power, it leads to this concept of hegemony. So hegemony is how people in power manage the ideologies of their society through social institutions and social forces. And so, you know, creating laws that Black people were 3/5 of a person, right? That was using power to put into practice to make real this ideology and this prejudice of Black people as inferior. And so these kind of work in different steps, and we're definitely at the point where hegemony has really kind of taken over in a lot of different spaces. You can say hegemony also along the lines of gender, right? How people in power have are men, right? A lot of men are in power, and how they've set up this dynamic that women are not viewed as equally. They're not viewed as equally in leadership positions, etc. That's kind of like the other, you know, you can kind of take any group or any identity, right, and find some sort of hegemonic belief or system that's built within it. And so when you're talking about deconstructing hegemony, so hegemony, remember, was that managing ideologies, people in power managing ideologies. So think of some dominant ideologies in society that are often perpetuated through media. The media can always tell you what we're supposed to believe, right? So Disney is so good at doing this, in that they teach us this idea of heteronormativity. So in almost every Disney movie, especially The Little Mermaid, y'all, was like probably the worst one. Little Mermaid, Cinderella, they're all kind of bad, actually. in teaching this idea that the girl is always seeking a man, right? Her whole narrative. And in Little Mermaid, to the point she gives up her whole entire voice, her ability to speak, right? For the sake of a dude. Like, some people just sit back and say, oh, it's just a movie, right? That is an ideology that is passively being taught to little girls, right? If you watch, and the newer movies are doing a great job. Like, I just watched Raya, because I have a 4-year-old. So I watched Raya and the Last Dragon. Dope movie, like dope movie. And I was having, especially the sociologist, I like to watch stuff and kind of pick it apart. Like, what are they teaching? Especially Disney. You have to be really critical of Disney because they have done this throughout history of teaching that a man and a woman are supposed to be together, that a woman's supposed to be passive and give up things for the sake of a man, or for a man, right? Whether that be a partner or her father, right? Think about that kind of construction that happens out of Disney as well. There's, you can go on for days. And so this is what I want you to write your personal narrative on, is think of like your favorite TV show or movie and what dominant ideology is being taught. So I just gave some examples of Disney and heteronormativity, right? The idea that a woman is always supposed to be seeking a man. There's no, heteronormativity is that it's, a man and a woman are meant to be together, right? That's this expectation. Disney reinforces that in society. We don't usually see gay or lesbian or queer or non-binary couples on TV shows, or specifically within Disney. And so I want you to think of a movie or TV show that either reinforces a hegemonic ideology, so a dominant ideology, whether that be, you can think of one, like another dominant ideology is that you're not supposed to marry or date outside of your race. So look at the different races of family, look at the genders, who's doing the cooking, who's doing the cleaning. Like, think about all the things that you've already been taught and learned within this class about gender roles, norms, all of these things, right? And how they're being taught through the media. I want you to find a specific show or show or movie and talk about the hegemonic ideology that's being taught. Or if you can find one that go against hegemonic ideas, I'll give away one, which is The Fosters. I love The Fosters, that show. It's about lesbian women who are raising children, and I love that show. It goes against a lot of different societal rules. So if you can find one that goes against hegemonic ideologies, you can also write on that one. And so I'm just kind of rounding out this conversation and how the construction of race, the social construction of race and assimilation, cultures, all of this kind of rounds out an understanding of racism and white supremacy. So racism is the ideology that one racial group is superior to all other racial groups. And I'm going to be very clear about the people in power, right, determine ideology, right? I can have the ideology that Black people are superior all I want, right? If I want to walk around my little life as an instructor, as a teacher, as an educator, as a mother, and have that ideology, that does not make me a racist person, right? Because I don't have the power to then go enact policies, to then go change entire ways of existence, to impact policing, etc., based on my ideology. And so people, there's kind of, and this is a back and forth in sociology as well. It's like, well, who can be racist, right? Anyone can be racist. That, we throw around that word all the time. Only people who have the power to shift an entire system of employment, in healthcare, in criminal justice system, can actually be racist people, right? That doesn't mean that I can't be, discriminate against people or hold prejudices against people, but do those then create an ideology that shifts an entire system? No. So racism is about power, and the power to completely impact the lives of an entire group of people. And there's only one group of people who have the power to do that, and that is white people. That's whiteness. Okay, that's not to say if you're white, you're racist, right? But white people as a collective from the beginning of, from colonization, right, have proved to be a race of people, a group of people who have enough power to completely shift policy, create laws, hold ideologies that stick in our various systems, right? So the idea that Black people are criminal came from whiteness, came from white people. And that very much then gets threaded into our various systems and structures, into policing, into our school system, into healthcare, into the grocery store, right? That's what I mean by the power to impact entire systems and structures. So, can people of color be racist? No, they cannot. They can participate in racism, right? So they could be an employer who won't necessarily say it out loud, but will not hire a certain group of people, right? That you do have the power to do that. So if you're a person of color in a position of power, you can enact racism, right? You can participate in racism, but you as an individual, even as an entire group of people, Black people are only 13% of the population. We do not have enough power, even if we all believed that Black people were better, they're better workers, they're better doctors, etc. We don't have the power to shift entire systems, right? We don't have the power to shift entire systems. And so white supremacy then is the belief that white people and people with lighter skin are superior to darker skinned people. Also understand, people of color can enact white supremacy. You could be a Black person or Chicana or, you know, whatever different identity and still believe in this idea of white supremacy. Almost, let me give it to you straight. Almost every culture has a belief in lighter skin due to white supremacy, has a belief in valuing lighter skin due to white supremacy ideologies. And so we are going to, I'm going to skip racial formations because I don't want to overwhelm. It's a really big concept. I may try and weave it in, but we're coming up on the end of the semester. But I really want to end out understanding discrimination. So discrimination is the act of denying people equal rights based on pre-existing social groupings. Anyone can discriminate, right? This is different than racism, where racism, you have to have the power to completely shift systems and ideologies and practices, right? Discrimination, everyone can discriminate, right? So there's this idea of individual discrimination, institutional discrimination. Individual discrimination are things like hate speech, hate crimes, and even believing in stereotypes can be a form of discrimination. Because if you believe that all Black people are criminal and you're an employer, right? You are acting upon that stereotype. Are you going to hire a Black person? Right? Let's be honest. We 100%, we all have these, we all hold different stereotypes about groups of people. You got to check yourself on them, right? You got to check yourself on what you believe or what you're taught to believe about certain groups of people. And then there's this term called institutional discrimination. And this is where sociology really sits, is in this understanding of social institutions that systematically deny people equal rights, period. Right? Systematically. It's not just one person. You could switch out the person every day, right? You could switch out a different person in charge every day. And yet the way the system runs, the way the system has been built will still perpetuate this discriminatory practice, right? Like racial profiling. So the fact that Blacks are more likely to be pulled over by police than whites, regardless of class status or occupation. And this just kind of brings me to, there was a video that went viral a couple of weeks ago of a black man in an army, I want to say army uniform, right? Being pulled out, having a taser pulled on him, taser or pepper spray, one of them, right? Pulled over in uniform by a police officer, right? And so in that moment, it didn't matter that he was also a part of an armed force, right? There was no solidarity across that understanding of being a part of an armed force in the way that policing is. Policing is an armed force, y'all, period, in a sentence. And so it didn't matter that this Black man was in the army, right? They saw Black man, right? Racial profiling is real. Dante Wright, right, pulled over for having an air freshener in his mirror, pulled over and murdered, right, for having an air freshener in his mirror. Would that have happened if he were white? The research tells us no. Period. Right? The research tells us no. Prison sentences. So people of color get harsher sentences for the same crime. So and it gets even crazier because their sentencing also depends on the race of the victim. So if the victim is a Black woman or a Black person, so the person who was attacked or whatever the case may be, the person is less likely to get a harsher sentence, right? But if the victim, the person who was at the opposite end of that crime, is white, they're more likely to punish harsher, right? This value of whiteness, white supremacy, white people being superior really finds itself in all of our various structures in society. The racial wealth gap, that's broken down very well in your textbook. So take a look at that, the income and wealth gaps that we have in society. And then our healthcare discrepancies. Some of you are doing your research projects on healthcare. And so I really encourage you, I will make your presentations public to one another so you can see, how how healthcare systems disproportionately impact Black women in particular, but also just communities of color in general. And so I already said what your personal narrative is going to be, but let me just reiterate. You're going to talk about a specific movie or TV show that either reinforces hegemonic ideologies, so it's playing along, right? It's telling us that this is how things should be, or it's going against a hegemonic ideology in our society. And I want you to write that out, do this weekend. And yeah, I think that's it. So email me with any questions. I know I kind of breezed over a few things, but I really wanted to hit on the most important pieces of this lecture today.